most recently from North Carolina, and I'm here for the big day on Saturday. And I appreciate your invitation to speak with you this evening. When I was in England, I basically had many occasions to speak out on LGBT issues, and so this was one of the things I was provoked to reflect on while I was there in England. So I've called the talk Sex and the Sins of the Fathers, Fertility, Religion, and Human Rights. So I begin with a quote from Bishop Gene Robinson, who is the couple gay man who was elected Bishop of New Hampshire. And I'm happy to say, I'm very proud to say that we now have another coupled, we have a couple of lesbian bishops in Los Angeles, which is my home diocese. And I'm happy to say I was able, upon my return to LA, to vote for her on every ballot. And she's great. Anyway, this quote is from Gene Robinson, and Gene Robinson said, the biggest obstacle to LGBT rights is the Abrahamic religions. That is to say, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The biggest obstacle to human rights for LGBT persons is the Abrahamic faiths. So I don't wish to speak for Judaism or Islam because I don't know enough about those faiths and the cultural context in which they operate. But I do wish to speak for Christianity, and I think that one can see his point. I'm sure that you could tell stories too. But let me just begin with a couple of examples that came to my attention. So the first one was in Vatican pronouncements about LGBT issues. You can find these documents on the Vatican website. There are lots of documents about these issues. And the Vatican's position about LGBT and human rights is, it puts them on the spot because post-Vatican II, the Roman Catholic Church is very proud of having developed a social justice emphasis. And they have done lots of wonderful things in advocating for the poor nations around the world, and also for peace, that powerful nations should use their power to wage peace instead of war, and so on and so on. So they have been advocates for human rights when it comes to poverty and when it comes to war and peace issues. So having that human rights emphasis, you might think that would go into other areas of ethical dispute, but LGBT issues are places where they have it difficult, right? So they don't want to say that we deny LGBT people human rights because that's contrary to their social justice teaching. But on the other hand, they are really totally opposed to LGBT lifestyles, right? So they try to deal with this by making a pair of distinctions. First, they distinguish between the homosexual condition, which they think is deformed, but not a sin, right? And homosexual activity, which is a grave, in my day we used to say, mortal sin, right? So they make that distinction, first of all. We've heard this before. Yes, it's bad every time. So they make that distinction. And then they make a distinction with respect to the state. They want to say that there's a distinction between the state respecting the human rights of individual LGBT persons qua individual persons, right? Because they're committed by their social justice teaching to respect the human rights of every human person, and what the state should do by way of creating institutions to house LGBT lifestyles. And so they want to say, well, the state, they reluctantly concede, and if I were reading the paper, I would give you a bunch of quotes, but you can go check it out for yourself. Believe me, I'm not making this up, right? They reluctantly say that, well, the state should tolerate people doing morally wrong things in private contexts. And therefore, they should tolerate LGBT activity in private, right? So they have to respect the right of human beings to behave that way in private. But it's an entirely different matter when it comes to the state passing laws that would establish institutional structures that would house LGBT lifestyles. And it's part of the Vatican's position that it's the duty of every Roman Catholic legislator or government official who has power to affect these things to vote against, or if it's already passed, to try to repeal any institutional housing that the state has created for those lifestyles. And their argument goes as follows. They say that a lifestyle or practice should be legally institutionalized only if it promotes the common good. Now guess what? Heterosexual marriage and the family promote the common good. And therefore it should have institutional housing, legally established institutional housing with protections and rights and so on and so forth. Because it does society so much good. And of course, the institution of heterosexual marriage does provide a service for society because it houses much of the sexual activity that reproduces the next generation, which keeps the society going. So that is a service that has been provided by this institution, right? So it does promote the common good if you think it's good for the human race to go on. But they conclude that therefore, so it should be institutionalized, and of course it is institutionalized, and so Roman Catholic legislators should uphold that institution. But they think that were LGBT lifestyles to receive institutional housing, as would happen if there were gay and lesbian marriage possibilities, then this would be, or if there were to be institutions for what we used to call in the olden days in the States common law marriage, they call them de facto relationships, right? Then that basically these other lifestyles would compete with marriage and therefore would undermine heterosexual marriage, and anything that undermines the common good should not receive legal housing or legal protection. This is their argument. Okay, and so they conclude that while the state should respect the right of individuals to do bad things in private, so long they should not respect the right. They should not respect the lifestyle to the degree of creating laws and so on that would institutionally house the lifestyle. So that's the Roman Catholic example. But repentance begins at home. So let me take an Anglican example, since I'm an Anglican. So Andrew Goddard and Ephraim Radner on the website, the evangelical Anglican website called Fulcrum. You can find it on the web. They produced many papers, but one of the papers they produced was in response to the Nigerian criminalization of homosexual activity. Now, the criminalization in Nigeria was particularly egregious insofar as it wasn't just that homosexual activity was criminalized, right? But if a couple of guys had dinner together, you could be arrested because, hey, how come you're having dinner with a guy? Or a couple of girls were probably less apt to be arrested because it's the way those things work out, right? But so lots of things were criminalized, and of course clergy who might, aid and abet LGBT partnerships could be jailed and so on. So the idea was they passed laws which imposed a penalty of 14 years in jail for people who were homosexual partners. And then there were lesser penalties, like 5 years, for clergy and others who had aided and abetted the movement in some way. And so Ephraim Radner and Andrew Goddard raised the question, well, what was wrong with this? Because, of course, we lefties in the Church of England, there were a few of us anyway, were saying, well, look at what happens. You know, why isn't the church speaking out against this? Why are they griping about Gene Robinson and not speaking out against this, right? What Ephraim Radner and Andrew Goddard argued was the following. They said, look, it's perfectly permissible for a state to criminalize behavior that undermines the common good. So that was one premise. And another premise they offered was, it's perfectly permissible for a state to criminalize seriously morally wrong behaviors, especially when they run against against mores that are accepted by the vast majority of people and run contrary to traditional morality. So those are their two premises. And then they said, well, in Nigeria, of course, the vast majority of people think LGBT lifestyles are an abomination, and so it's perfectly okay to criminalize them. They draw this conclusion. Fulcrum is the liberal evangelical C of E website, right? It's perfectly okay to criminalize. I'm not giving the most fair-minded tone of voice to this, right? So it's perfectly okay to criminalize because the vast majority of people think it's an abomination, and therefore think it undermines the common good. And the only thing they thought was that perhaps the penalty was a little bit severe. 14 years, right? And the Vatican also kind of hastened to add that basically they thought that the countries which had criminalized homosexual behavior to the point of the death penalty had gone too far. Okay, so these are two Christian examples where institutions of the Christian faith have taken positions that it would be okay to not to facilitate, give legal housing to institutional housing to LGBT lifestyles, and that it would even be okay to criminalize these behaviors with significant penalties, although they're saying, well, maybe 14 years is a little too much, right? Okay. Now, from a liberal point of view, from a political liberal's point of view, these premises that they appeal to in rationalizing their decisions, of course, are highly debatable. Of course, the idea that things that promote the common good should receive institutional housing, I mean, that's, I guess, you know, that might be a defensible premise. But the idea that the vast majority, behaviors that the vast majority of citizens or that traditional mores think are morally wrong should be criminalized seems like it's quite another matter, because we are all familiar with the fact that traditional mores have been unjust, right? In my country, we went along with slavery for decades. And we went along with racial segregation for decades. The vast majority of people were against mixed-race marriages until, you know, the second half of probably the 1970s or something, right? That doesn't mean that it was right to criminalize that, right? I mean, that's a ridiculous thing for a Christian to say. But there it is, right? And another point is, of course, that there are empirical premises that are advanced in these arguments, such as, if there were competitor lifestyles, that this would undermine the institution of marriage. Or another point, which is that they act as if there was only one institution of marriage throughout history. Since Adam and Eve, it's all been the same. But I do want to say that I would never have married had the relationship I was contracting with my husband been the same sort that Abraham and Sarah had. I mean, he wants, you know, a modern woman would want something like that, right? And that would be, and gay people wouldn't want that kind of arrangement either, I should think, probably. So, you know, the word marriage is a homonym, like bank. You know, it can be a river bank, it can be a financial institution. There have been lots of institutions that have gone by that name. And they're assuming that, well, that just because it has been the one that served the purpose of housing most of the sexual activity that reproduced the next generation, that would be the only one that could do that. I mean, but, you know, the Israelis, after all, for a time, they had kibbutz. And the kibbutz, you know, had a kind of collective child rearing and so on. And, you know, it's an empirical question whether that didn't work as well. And the whole idea that the institutions we have are the only ones that could work and could serve society in the process of bringing up the kids for the next generation, producing and bringing up kids for the next generation is highly, highly debatable, right? The question then, since these are kind of obvious questions, I mean, it doesn't take, it's not rocket science to raise these questions. So the question that it produces in my mind is, well, look, these people are really smart. Cardinal Ratzinger is very smart. You know, he was a philosopher after all. A philosopher by training. Some of you are. I mean, he's a very smart man. Ephraim Radner, I knew him. He was a student at Yale when I was at Yale. He was brilliant. I mean, he's truly brilliant. And Andrew Gardner is a pretty smart guy too. And they are definitely serious Christian people. And so the question is, well, how do people who are brilliant of mind and devout in their religious practice bring themselves to the point where they can say, well, no institutional housing for this kind of lifestyle? I mean, here's another premise that they are overlooking, right? A liberal would say it's not just that a liberal society should create institutions to house things that promote the common good. It's part of the government or the state's job to create the infrastructure within which people can pursue their projects and aims. And to create this infrastructure for some and not for others is unfair. Right? So if as was the case in the United States and before the Civil Rights Movement in the 20th century, you create institutions to house same-race marriage and not mixed-race marriage, it's unjust because you haven't given the infrastructure needed for people of different races to, you know, pursue their desires to set up a household. So how do people bring themselves to these conclusions? How do they get there? So I'd like to say, well, you can kind of see how people would get to this position in 4 easy steps. So this is my analysis, and you can tell me where you disagree with it, of course. Okay, so step 1 has to do with theological modeling. Okay. So step 1 is, this is my basic fundamental theological premise, that God is very, very big, and we are very, very small. And what that means is that it's very hard for us to get a grip on who God is and what God is up to. This is a human predicament. It's created by what I call the size gap between what God is and what we are. It's really hard to get a grip on it. Right? So, how do we get a grip on it? Well, of course, it's taken the human race centuries to even begin to get a grip. The whole idea that we could figure it out for ourselves, all by ourselves individually, we don't have a prayer of getting very far with that, right? We have to rely on, we have to start with what other people have groped towards before us, right? So the appeal to tradition is reasonable because, you know, it took a long time to get very far at all with this whole project of trying to figure out who God is. I mean, I like to think about Abraham, right? I mean, he was supposed to be a friend of God. Now, that's a pretty nifty relationship. But if you read his stories, what did he learn about God? you learn that maybe, or maybe not, God was for child sacrifice. You know, and that took a whole lifetime of wandering around with God and having wow experiences that most of us, haven't had. And maybe he wasn't interested in child sacrifice. Okay, so it takes a long while for us to work up on it, right? So we have to kind of start with what the previous generation started with, and start trying to sort of orient ourselves, and then start questioning and disputing what they came up with, and see how far we can get, and so on, right? So there's a reason when it comes to theology to appeal to tradition, because the subject is so hard that we individually can't just make it up for ourselves. There are mathematicians who can reinvent arithmetic when they're 3 years old. But, I wasn't one of those. I had to appeal to tradition and be educated by the elementary school teachers. Well, all of us are in that boat when it comes to the God thing. So it's very hard to get a grip on who God is. It takes decades, generations, so we have to appeal to tradition. And that makes sense to look back and try to profit from other people's attempts to work it out, right? Well, what do people do when they try to say who God is and what God means? Well, one strategy that is very common is to use social analogies. So it's part of mainstream biblical religion to suppose that God is personal. And so if we're relating to God as to another person, then we kind of like to know what God expects of us and what we can expect of God. And so what we do is to use social analogies. So in the Bible, there are lots of these social analogies. God is the king, we are the subjects. Well, we kind of have, it's as if God were the king and we are the subjects. Well, we kind of have an idea of what, in those days, they had an idea of what the king would expect of them, and they kind of had an idea of what they could expect of the king. And so that gave them a little framework within which to try to relate to this being, right? Or God is the father, and we are the children. Well, we kind of have a grip on parent-child relations a little bit, and so that gave a clue as to what mutual expectations might turn out to be, right? Or God is a friend, and well, that's another image. That's God is a mother. That's not a very common image, but it's in there a little bit. You scour the text and you can find 3 or 4 places where that's suggested, right? So, but there are lots of, so we have these social analogies, and what we do is we map them onto the heavens. And we say, well, it's as if God were playing a role in our social system, right? And that's what people have been doing for centuries, right? And so we have lots of roles mapped up, social analogies mapped up to the heavens. Lots of different ones. And of course, there have been, in the Bible itself, there are 1,700 years worth of civilizations, which are very different from one another. And they've all been mapping up. And then these things get mapped on top of one another, and there are lots of tensions and so on. And we can expect this will go on indefinitely, right? Because so long as people think that God is personal, then they're going to want to know what can we expect of God and what does God expect of us. And then the obvious move is to reach for a social analogy and say, well, it's as if, and then try to spell out some disanalogies and so on. Right? Now, this is a strategy that's played throughout the Bible. It's played throughout the history of theology. And already it has one consequence of importance, which is connected with another fact, which is this, that human beings are socially challenged. What I mean by that is that when we try to get together and organize ourselves into collectives, well, we're not very good at it, because whatever way we organize ourselves, we always come up with a system which creates inequalities. We come up with a system in which privileges some at the expense of others. And sometimes these inequalities are not intentional, because human beings don't really understand There may be some sociologists among us who understand much better than I do, but we don't understand system behavior very well. So a lot of these inequalities or downsides, injustices are not even recognized. But they certainly aren't intended. It's not what you're intended to produce when you set up the system. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they aren't. But what's the case is that because human beings are socially challenged, all the social systems we've come up with have these systemic downsides in that they spawn systemic evils, right? Systemic injustices. So what happened? And we're all complicit in these injustices, even if we didn't plan them, even when we don't notice them, because the injustice it's a product of the whole system. So insofar as we acquiesce in playing different roles in the society, we have bought into a system that generates these big downsides for other people. So listen, it's not as bad as if we, enforce the injustice all by ourselves, but it's bad, right? We're complicit in this, right? So when we map up social analogies onto the heavens and say, well, it's as if God is playing a role in our social system, we're already implying that God is complicit in the injustices they generate. So that's step one. So then we get to step two, which is true religion and civil religion. So now true religion, if we read the Hebrew Bible, true religion sort of gives out a theology of life. The Torah kind of focuses on what I would call a theology of life. And the idea is that God is life, and God is, for everything else, the source of life, and its only reliable sustainer. And creatures don't have a right to life, but they receive life as a gift. And because material life isn't self-sustaining, God concedes to creatures the permission to consume other bits of life. We have to eat something to keep going, right? We get permission to eat things, so long as we behave as courteous guests and show respect for the life of the other creatures, right? So that's a theology of life you find in the Torah, and that's reinforced by lots of things. But there's a competing theology, so to speak. Just roughly speaking, the sociologist Durkheim wanted to say that every society deifies itself. And it deifies itself on the basis of the following claims. I mean, society claims to be the source of life. And that everybody who's a member of society depends for his or her existence and well-being on the society and the social system working well. And so the corollary to this is that society is entitled, that we owe it to society to play the roles, or a variety of roles assigned, to do our part to make the society work by entering into these roles. Right? And so, on the one hand, God is the source of life, but on the other hand, society says, well, we're the source of life, and our roles are what you have an obligation to enter into and perform, right? But if you then kind of fuse these by virtue of the premise that, well, the society is deifying itself, right? Then it turns God into, on the one hand, at least a mascot, or a totem animal who is a totem whose job it is to keep the society going and make sure that the society remains intact. And in some conflations, it turns out that God is, well, after all, the founder of the society, the one who laid down the social order, and the one who enforces it with God's commands. Right? And you can find both things in the Bible, right? I mean, after all, the law of Moses is, okay, when you come into the land, here's what I want you to do. You're supposed to organize the folks this way. And so God is supposed to be the author of all this legislation. And so God is the author, and God is the enforcer. If you don't live according to the commandments, I'm going to send in some big power, and they're going to cream you. So listen up, right? So basically, what happens when you fuse true religion with civil religion, which happens in every society that I've been a part of. What happens is that basically you are making God the enforcer, the inventor and enforcer of all the systemic evils that the society generates. Right? It's one thing to say, well, I'm imagining God is playing a role in society, so then God's complicit like all the other role players, right? But now we're sort of saying, well, you know, our society, our social norms must be followed because, after all, God laid them down, and God is going to enforce them, and God made them up. And furthermore, since God, of course, is smarter than we are, we may not understand the properties of systems very well, and we may not have intended to generate the injustices, but God, of course, is all-wise, and so God would have figured it out in advance. And so God actually becomes the author, the designer, the sustainer, the enforcer of all, not only the good-making features of the society, but all of the injustices. Okay, that's step 2. Step 3 is to conflate civil religion with fertility religion. Okay, now this is easy because civil society, and we find this in the Vatican documents, it's all over these Vatican documents, civil society has an interest in the management or the exercise, the way the reproductive potential of the society is used, right? Because if society wants to survive, then it wants the next generation to be produced and reared, at least enough people and with enough health and skill and so on to keep the society going. Social survival requires that the reproductive potential of the society be managed in such a way that that happens, right? So that's certainly a legitimate interest that a society might have, unless you think the human race shouldn't go on, and sometimes I wonder myself, but I kind of talk myself out of it because I think, well, God must have liked the human race, so I shouldn't second guess it too much, right? But in any event, civil religion then has a big stake in the appropriate use of, the effective use of the reproductive potential of society. And so the society lays down a lot of rules about sexual behavior. It sets up institutions about sexual behavior, but it figures out implicitly or explicitly behaviors that it thinks will serve this common good, which is the continuation of society, serve its own social survival, and those which would be counterproductive. And the ones that it thinks will be really, really dangerous, it erects taboos against. Now, taboos are social institutions, they're social structures that are erected to make certain kinds of behaviors and patterns unthinkable, right? The taboo casts behavior, lifestyle, whatever it is, into outer darkness. Basically, because they don't even want you to think of going there, right? It's not just that you shouldn't steal the penny candy from the grocery store. You can think about that, but then you're socialized not to do it, or not to do it most of your life, or something like that, right? But there are other behaviors that society not only doesn't want you to do, they don't even want you to contemplate going there, right? And so the society erects taboos, which makes it unthinkable, unspeakable, inarticulate, right? Even to ask, well, why shouldn't I do that, is already to violate the taboo, right? Because it's supposed to be unthinkable. So taboos are inarticulate and irrational, or at least non-rational, and they are set up against the behaviors that society imagines would undermine its attempts at social survival. So there are lots of sexual taboos in every society. They're different in different societies, but there are lots of sexual taboos, and it reflects this idea that civil religion is easily focused upon fertility religion. It's a version of a fertility religion because the social survival so depends upon this effective use of the reproductive potential. And so basically then, God, as the author of society and its social rules, becomes the author of all of the taboos, all the rules and regulations and all of the taboos. And this becomes one of God's big interests. And we can see this in the Bible. The Bible is very focused on the idea that the Canaanite religion was a fertility religion. But believe me, the religion of ancient Israel, as we read it in the Bible, is, or don't believe me, read it for yourself, it's a fertility religion too. What does God promise Abraham? Land and fertility, dynasty. You will have numerous offspring. And your flocks and herds will reproduce. Land and dynasty. Why do you want the land? So that you can feed the sheep. So that they will be fertile, right? In the covenant curses and blessings, the blessings are that God will provide fertility. God is the author of fertility. God will make sure the flocks and herds are fruitful and multiplying. God will make sure the weather is good enough for the crops to grow and be fruitful and multiplying. And God will make sure that your wives have many children. But if you don't keep God's commandments, then none of those things will happen, and the whole thing will turn into a desert, which will be sterile. Sterile. So the rewards and punishments that are highlighted in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, are all about fertility. God is the author of fertility. That's one of God's big jobs. And it's in the creation story. Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth. God said so, and God is the one who makes it possible, and if you do what God wants, God will provide fertility, and if you don't do what God wants, God will take it away. So the Bible itself gives us a version of fertility religion. It's just not the Canaanite fertility religion. It's a different fertility religion. Fine. Well, the Vatican is full of fertility religion too. If you start reading Vatican documents about marriage, some of the more recent ones, actually, start with a tone of voice that we can all relate to. It has a bias. They think of marriage as a good institution because there's covenant, and there's complementarity, and there's an openness to life. And they talk about these in very idealistic terms. And one can say, well, those are good-making features in a relationship, that it's covenanted, so it can take a long time to develop and solidify and provide stability and security, and within which people can experiment, blah, blah, blah. That's a good-making feature. We can see that that's, we don't have to say it's the only good-making feature, but it's a good-making feature. And complementarity, well, it's good if some people are good at one thing and other people are good at another thing. I'm good at cleaning, my husband is good at balancing the checkbook, and that's very sexist, but that's the way it turned out. Whatever it is, but the complementarity can be good in relationships. We can see that would be so. And openness to life, to being hospitable to life in various forms, and hospitable to creativity. We can see that those are good-making features. But of course, these features are not gender-specific, right? Those features could, the Vatican wants to say, well, we must see that human beings are not just animals. We are animals, and we inherit things from animals. But then the Vatican documents go on to say, but we're persons, and persons have something more than animals. And furthermore, we're spirits. That means we can reach out to God and so forth. And so there's more to human beings than just being a cow or an animal, So we think, yes, that's right. And then they give us these three things. We think, yes, that's right. And so those things can characterize partnerships. It doesn't matter what mixed match of genders you have, right? It could. But when the Vatican gets into it, having said that in the first few paragraphs, then they say, and as to genital sexual activity, it's only okay when you expect to, when you want to reproduce children, and otherwise, whether you're married or not, you shouldn't do it. Right? And I think, okay, you want to minimize sexual intercourse, and then you want to restrict it to times when it will maximize the reproductive potential of the intercourse that you allow. It's sounding very much like fertility religion to me, right? So my main point is that if you read this great swatch of Vatican documents, and I can give you lots of quotes, but basically they start kind of high-minded, recognizing that human beings are spiritual, personal, not merely animals, although we are animals. But then when they get down to, and when can you do it? Well, it's only if it's going to reproduce children in the, what they call the natural way, right? So they're 30, yeah, so it gets very biomechanical, right? And so they're against in vitro fertilization. I mean, one reason might be that they're throwing away fertilized eggs, and so that would be like abortion, but they're against it because it's not the biomechanics that we came with, right? Even though that would reproduce more children, and be open to life, et cetera, et cetera. So there's fertility religion. So basically then we move from social analogies to conflating real religion, true religion, with civil religion. Then we note that civil religion has a big department that has to do with fertility religion. And then we get God as the author of all the, and enforcer of all these sexual taboos that we came with. Now there's one more step which characterizes these conservative documents. See, these people are very smart. So taboos in themselves are non-rational. I mean, they're irrational. They're trying to make something unthinkable and unspeakable. And so they're not rationalized. You say, why not? As people did in the 60s. You're not supposed to even go there, but the people don't have anything, the church especially, had nothing to say, right? Because it was not speaking or thinking about those things. That was the way it was. But of course, when you get to be a theologian or an ethicist, then you think maybe you should have something to say. So the Vatican and even Radner and Andrew Goddard, they get offended if you say, well, you're just embracing taboo morality. You talk about an abomination to the Lord, right? And that's taboo morality. We need to have, we're rational beings. We need to have something articulate to say here. And so they say, yes, of course, let us theorize. Right? We're not just operating on taboos. We have arguments. Now, the arguments of the conservative evangelical, sex and gender conservative evangelical Anglicans tend to go like this, and they involve appeals to authority, right? They are, it's in God's word written that it's not okay, right? So one of these people who is very prominent in the Church of England said to me, look, every time it comes up in the Bible, homosexuality comes up in the Bible, it's condemned. It's in God's word written, and that settles it. That's that argument, because God's word written is the ultimate authority for Christians. Faith and practice for Christians. That's the evangelical premise, right? The Vatican, of course, thinks that the Bible is an authority, but there are other authorities, right? And they even appeal to philosophy. They say, well, there's such a thing as natural law. And natural law is something that reason can discover. And you ought to do what, as Aristotle put it, right reason dictates. And the natural law dictates this or that, then that's what you ought to do. Or if the natural law forbids this or that, then that's what you ought not to do, right? And it's a matter of what reason can see. So we say, well, okay, let's just grant you that for the sake of argument. I'm not a natural law theorist myself, but suppose we gave you that from the idea that we ought to do what the natural law commands and avoid what the natural law forbids. How do we get to that, from that to no LGBT lifestyles, or how do we get there? We need another premise, right? We need the premise that these are unnatural, right? But of course, that's the premise that needs defense. It says no birth control, it's unnatural. And you say, well, that's the premise that needs defense. What's unnatural about it, Where's your argument for that? Where's your evidence? Well, it doesn't come forth. Because, you know, and of course it's a matter of empirical study. It's just assumed. And then, I mean, there's some really telling passages in which you start out with this natural law argument, and then suddenly, you know, it's so different from everything that it couldn't possibly be approved under any circumstances that, you know, you think, okay, you just lost it. We didn't get our argument for that premise, so, you know, so there. Okay. So my claim is then that the way conservatives talk themselves into the idea that it's certainly okay to criminalize LGBT lifestyles, and certainly okay not to provide institutions to house these lifestyles and to give legal protections and benefits and so on to these lifestyles, the way they talk them into it is through these 4 steps, right? There's the social analogy, which makes God a member of our society who plays a social role and therefore is complicit in the injustices of our society. There is then the claim that God is the conflation of true religion with civil religion, which turns God into the author and enforcer of the social norms within our society. Then there is the fact that civil religion is so focused on the fertility aspects, right, the management of reproductive potential, that God becomes the author and defender and enforcer of all of the sexual taboos that the society forwards. And then there's the rationalization of these taboos, which depends on certain kinds of particular premises, which are either taken from authority or left under-defended. And what I want to say is, amongst other things, that this kind of picture, which I think, I guess I thought there was something to it in any event. I mean, what's happening is that God becomes, I mean, they often say, you often hear in the debates that LGBT activists are giving in to the spirit of this present age, right? But I'm going to say that this strong arm from tradition, strong argument from tradition, which says, well, okay, we have to start with the fertility religion of the Hebrew Bible and leave that in place because we basically have to start with tradition when we start trying to figure out who God is, and we make God a member of society, we make God the author and enforcer of society, we make God the author and I mean, basically what we're doing is appealing to the spirit of past ages as a justification